Hi, everybody. As far as I recall, last class we just barely missed finishing these notes. So I'm going to pick up where we left off. And of course, if anything that I go over today you have questions about, feel free to email me. We may try other methods of e learning as time goes on, but for now, this will suffice. So, last class we left off with world or global cities. We had talked about what these cities are known for. They generally do something that's globally important. So, like New York is well known for the New York Stock Exchange. They're also home to the UN. London controls interest rates around the world, among other things. Tokyo is well known for fashion and technology and so on. But there's also a type of urban area called a megalopolis. A megalopolis is a bunch of cities that have grown together. So they form one big urban area. There are big ones of these, small ones of these, many around the world, but there's some even in this area. The best one, though, is known as the Boswash Corridor. As its name tells you, it goes from Boston to Washington, D.C., and includes cities like Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore. While this picture that's coming up is a bit outdated, I'll show you a better one in a minute. It's more up to date. This one shows you Boston at the top, Washington, D.C., or Richmond at the bottom, and you can see all the bright lights. So this would have been taken from a composite of satellite photos at nighttime, and shows you that there's almost one continuous splotch of light from Boston to Washington. The idea of a megalopolis is more just that you've got all these urban areas that have grown together, and so really where one urban area ends and another begins obviously is not really obvious anymore. Here's the more up-to-date version of this. More detailed, more clear picture, but also more up-to-date. So you can see that really it does look like one continuous splotch of light. And even in some of these areas in the top where you see there might be gaps, really some of the lights that do exist or the homes that may be here may not show up just because they're not big enough or whatever. So this is really just one big long urban area. Pretty amazing. All right, now on to the step for today. U.S. urban models are pretty easy to learn about and understand, but if you haven't spent the time to look at them in any sort of detail or with a critical view, then it's worth starting there, just because otherwise they can get bunched together in your head. You may not be able to tell the difference between them. But they're all very similar, so again, good reason to go over what the basics are between each of these, maybe find some patterns. So notice that question at the bottom. What are some generalizations we can make about all three models? Take a minute and see if you can figure it out yourself. Try and find some patterns. Don't say something like, well, they all have colors, or, they all have at least 5 zones or something. Give me something that is a spatial relationship, maybe a pattern you see in each. So I'll just let you pause it here for a second. Try and figure out 2 things that you notice between all 3 models. All right, if you've paused it or unpaused it by now, you may notice that all 3 models, and we'll learn about 4, but all 3 models have a central business district, a CBD. All 3 models have a relationship between the housing and what that type of housing or certain types of housing are near. So if you haven't noticed that yet, see if you can take a look. What is the number 5 high-class residential typically located next to, or where is it located in relation to the CBD? Seems to be that the high-class housing is often located farthest from the CBD, certainly true in the concentric zone model. You see the 5 on the outside there. The sector model, which is in the top right, more like pie slices, has a large amount of the high-class housing towards the right side of the screen. In other words, most of the high-class housing, like a slice of pizza, is largest on the outside. And same in the bottom left, it seems to be farthest from the CBD, whereas all the other numbers look to be closer. I'll note that that bottom left multiple nuclei model has a bunch of other numbers which we won't really talk about much. They're not a big factor in this model. So just note that high-class residential tends to be located farthest from the CBD, whereas then the opposite is generally true. The low-class residential generally is located right next to the CBD. These models are a bit outdated. There's a fourth model we'll look at that's more up to date. So now that you at least have a basic understanding of all three of these models, you can easily differentiate between them. So these generalizations that you've got here, hopefully you've written down, makes it easier to get the difference between them all. So I'll move on. If you need to pause it, of course, go ahead, but I'm going to move on. The first two models we'll talk about are similar to each other, and you'll see the names up here: Burgess's concentric zone model and Hoyt's sector model. You should know the names for these models, that is Burgess and Hoyt, as well as what they're generally described as, the concentric zone model or the sector model. Let's start with Burgess. First thing to understand about Burgess that would make it easier to understand this model is what that word concentric means. Concentric just means within, basically. So if you notice, the concentric zone model has this shape. Where is it? There it is. Should have come up earlier. You've got circles within circles. That's concentric. The major point of emphasis for the concentric zone model is simply that everything is oriented or located based on distance from the CBD. The model, for that reason, follows a lot of the principles of the bid-rent curve. In other words, the most expensive land is closer to the CBD, the cheapest land is farther from the CBD. As a result of that, you'll see different types of housing located in different areas. Of course, the densest housing will be closest to the CBD, and the most rural sorts of housing will be towards the outside of the city, almost what you would call the suburbs today. The Hoyt sector model is not based so much on distance from the CBD, but access to the CBD and transportation. I'll put up this model, and then we'll talk about both of them and how they're based on Chicago. I would suggest, for an example, that you draw these models. That's the only sensible way, really, to portray these as examples in your notes, or in your note cards, rather. The other thing that you've got a term for in here is CBD. You might be looking for an example. If you are, I would do one of two things. You could either sort of draw what a CBD typically looks like. You can see it there in the bottom right, often lots of tall buildings. Or you could give an example of Chicago's CBD. You may know Chicago has one. Sometimes city maps even refer to central parts of cities as their CBD. For example, I was in New Orleans years ago and was interested to see that their city maps officially call their downtown business district the Central Business District. I don't know if I've seen that referred to on Chicago's maps, but that's because ours has its own nickname. That is one you may know of, called The Loop. So The Loop is our Central Business District. Either way, you can see that these are both based on Chicago. So how could these both be true? Concentric rings and sort of pie slices, sector model. Well, if you know a bit about Chicago, and I think all of you do, you can probably find ways that both of these models fit. At least today, if you think of Chicago, you can probably think of it having three different sides, so to speak: the north side, south side, and the west side. And in relation to the sector model, you might be able to tell me that there's some part of Chicago that is more high class, some side of Chicago that's more high class residential. So in your head, is it the north side, south side, or the west side? You're probably thinking accurately that it's the north side. Now, of course, you do find some nice housing on the south and the west side, but generally some of those neighborhoods are not quite as good, at least not these days. Used to be that the south side was the nicest part of Chicago. How things change. Anyway, you can probably also find zones of transportation and industry, so you can hopefully understand at least a little bit better how Chicago follows, in part, the sector model. But it also follows the concentric zone model in some ways. First of all, in the most basic sense, a lot of the most expensive housing in urban areas tends to be towards the outside of those urban areas, at least in the suburbs. This is certainly true in Chicago. For example, the most expensive real estate listing in Chicago for about 10 years now has been Michael Jordan's former home up in wherever he used to live, Northbrook or something like that. But you'll find tons of other wealthy suburbs. Certainly you could find very expensive real estate listings in downtown Chicago, but even in some of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city, you won't find every house or most houses being $1 million. I should say residence instead of house. You don't find many houses in the most expensive neighborhoods in Chicago. You have more condo buildings, high rises. So yeah, you can find multi-million-dollar condos, but even in Chicago's wealthy neighborhood known as the Gold Coast, where a lot of the most expensive housing is, you'll find apartments that rent for $1,000 a month, maybe $1,500 a month. They won't be great. They'll be pretty small. But the point is that if you think of the most expensive housing as being downtown, in some ways that's true, but generally, according to the concentric zone model, most cities have the most expensive housing towards the outside. That's because that's where you've got more land, it's cheaper, you can build more stuff that's bigger, more ostentatious, because you got more land. These two models are also fairly outdated, at least especially the concentric zone model. We don't have industries really located near downtown anymore. We have some, but not nearly as many as there used to be. Certainly don't think of them like you see in Zone B there, like these polluting factories. Both of these models came from the 1920s. So since then, of course, we know cities have changed, suburbs have grown, industries have left, and so on. The map that you see on the screen now, a bit blurry, but shows you also how Chicago has both of these models applying at the same time. You can kind of see here this top stretch of Chicago, this light yellow pie piece that is the high class housing, so that's kind of the north side of Chicago. But you've also got pie slices, like this sort of orangey color on the left side. Pardon me, not pie slices, concentric rings with this orangey pie slice on the left. Why do I keep calling it pie slices? Concentric ring. The purple concentric ring, also kind of like a pie slice in some places. Showing you that Chicago follows both models. The second to last model we'll talk about is this multiple nuclei model. This model is very similar to the other models in that it's got the same components with a few extra. The only real difference between this model and the other ones, or why it exists, is that single bullet point up there at the top. This is based on the idea that some areas are going to specialize in certain activities causing multiple nodes or nuclei. So for example, of course, the downtown area specializes in business. But what else do we have going on? Well, looking down here at the key, you can see you've got two manufacturing zones, number 2 and number 6. So let's find those on the map here. Number 2 is this purple one. Number 6 is the orange one. I don't know what you call that, salmon maybe? So as we look at the map or the diagram, the model, you can see that one zone near the CBD seems to be attracting heavy industry, whereas another attracts light industry. Why is that? Well, this model, again, accounts for the fact that there's different specialties in different areas, probably because of geographic factors. So near the CBD, perhaps you've got access to major rail transportation. So it might be good for a steel manufacturer. Whereas out here in the suburbs, maybe you've got access to a river or maybe light rail or highways. So different geographic factors often are going to cause certain parts of the city to specialize in other things. Even still, you've got some of the same patterns. You've got high-class residential, number 5, towards the outside. But this model does account for the suburbs. Number 8 and number 9 are residential and industrial suburbs. Don't really think about that as a major part of this model. So while this model does have suburbs in it, all three of these models we've learned about so far are really before the suburbs boomed. So these are kind of all outdated in that sense and focus instead more on the urban areas. So the final model we'll talk about then is the one known as the galactic city model, also sometimes called the peripheral model. Just like a galaxy, where there's a central point, sort of, and things revolving around it. Same idea here with the galactic city model, or the peripheral model. There's something in the center and things on the periphery. This is the model that accounts for the suburbs. It's based on the idea that the suburbs grow and draw people from the inner city or the main node to the surrounding areas, creating these so-called edge cities. Edge cities or boom burbs are somewhat different from exurbs. Exurbs are just distant suburbs, but an edge city is a city that seems to have some sort of unique draw to it in the surrounding area of a main urban area like Chicago. I'll give you examples of this, but I think the best example is Rosemont. You probably have been by Rosemont. If you don't know Rosemont that well, I'll tell you that Rosemont has a whole bunch of stuff that makes it unique. It's got restaurants, Hofbrauhaus, which is a very large venue. It's got tons of bars within a small area. It's almost like downtown Chicago, but a very tiny sample of it. It's got some office buildings, tons of office buildings. When you go by Rosemont on Highway 90 or around 294, you'll see high-rises, office buildings with brand names on them. These buildings are maybe 15, 20 stories. You will find very few residences. It's mostly a city that's known for its businesses and its entertainment attractions. Other than the stuff I've told you about, you may know that there's a mall there, an outlet mall. They also have Rivers Casino. You may know Rosemont if if these things don't sound familiar to you yet. You may know or have seen that if you drive by it on the highway, there's a building with a giant concrete facade, and on the side it says indoor skydiving. They also are home to Allstate Arena and the Rosemont Theater. There's probably other stuff that I'm forgetting, but the point is Rosemont kind of has developed this identity over the last 30 years as, and they have a convention center. It's developed this identity as a major entertainment and business area, not really well known for residences. So the Galactic City model is reflected in Rosemont in that Rosemont has developed this unique identity, as have other suburbs. You may not know the suburb of Elk Grove that well, but it's a more industrial suburb. So is Wheeling, about, half hour west of Wilmette. You may know that other parts of the Chicagoland area have developed identities like number 7. There's airport complexes or airport areas. Of course, that's O'Hare. You'll find other neighborhoods that are more shopping mall oriented, like Rosemont. Or where I grew up, Schaumburg, which is home near to Schaumburg, which is home to Woodfield Mall. So Rosemont is kind of more like number 8. You get the idea. Urban areas are basically the center of this model. That yellow area is basically not the CBD; it's the whole urban area. And then surrounding this model, surrounding the city rather, most of this model is that green stuff, which is the cities. Oh gosh, why am I confusing myself? These are the suburban areas, pardon me. So at the most basic level, if I've confused you, the Galactic City model is the model that accounts for the growth of the suburbs. The vast majority of that green space is residential housing, which is mostly what the suburbs are, punctuated by these unique urban areas that sometimes have some sort of flavor, whether it's an airport, a shopping mall, some sort of industrial complex. So hopefully this made sense. The last thing I'll see if we can do is just find some trace of this in the real world. Models are only good in the isotropic world. So let's look at the real world. I don't know much about the city of Atlanta, but if you were to try and find evidence of these models in a real life city like Atlanta, you might want to consider certain types of data. You can't just really skate around the city that easily on Google Earth and find proof of these models. So what if you were to look at some data? What data would you want to examine to try and find out if these models actually apply or exist? I would suggest that one thing you could look at, since we know that type of housing is a major part of these models, is wealth data. You could look at income data or median housing value. If you wanted to know where the most dense housing is, you could look at population density. So I've got a couple maps here of that data, and then I'll show you the real world, and we can see if we can spot some of the peripheral or Galactic City model as well. So here's Atlanta. The red lines you see snaking in and out of Atlanta are highways. You can see this is a choropleth map with the darkest colors representing the highest population density. So understandably, you've got the most dense areas seemingly where all these highways intersect in the middle of the map. Somewhere around there seems to be, right there in the center, downtown Atlanta. It's not exactly it, not smack in the middle of your screen, but I'll point out, actually, this will be relevant later when we talk about the density gradient. Right now, just about in the middle of your screen is a number 1-3. In the center of all that dark stuff, there's this sort of light brown or medium brown color. That is actually downtown Atlanta. You may wonder why the absolute center of downtown Atlanta is not quite that dense. Well, I'll tell you briefly that, again, while we'll get into it later with this term density gradient, the people that live in a city generally don't live downtown, smack in the middle of downtown. You may remember why, if you remember what's in the center of all these models we've looked at. It's the central business district. So the most expensive land is often used for businesses, and while you will find some residences there, generally the residents compile or condense themselves around the central business district. So how do you see the concentric zone model here? Well, you might notice, of course, that again, the most dense housing is in the middle, the sort of medium density housing is around that, and the lightest density housing is farthest out. So in that sense, we've kind of got rings here. The other data that I'll show you is the wealth data here, income data. And on this map, you can probably see that Atlanta's got an identity, or rather a division, that's kind of like the sector model, pie slices, whereas the previous map showed you as more like concentric zones, rings of density. This shows you the wealth. Again, in a choropleth fashion, it uses the darkest colors to show you the wealthiest areas, and it seems pretty obvious that this northern third of Atlanta seems to be the most wealthy. Where's the medium class housing? Looks to be to the left of that, sort of straight west, and to the right of that, straight east. Excuse me. And on the bottom, it looks like the southern third or so is probably the poorest third of Atlanta. So does it reflect pie slices? At least to a certain extent. We don't really see where the transportation zone is, but you can obviously spot that there's elements of the sector and the concentric zone model when you look at just one city, Atlanta. Before we wrap up then, let's see if we can find out some stuff about the suburbs in that periphery or galactic city model. So I'm going to go to Google Earth, and I've got Atlanta dialed up here, and we're going to see the surrounding areas from Atlanta. If we were in class, I'd have you look around on your own, but I'll point out that it's pretty easy to spot some of these Rosemont-like suburbs. Now, again, the periphery or galactic city model doesn't all have to entertainment suburbs. You might have industrial suburbs. You might have an airport zone. I can find some of those around Atlanta pretty easily, but I know of one area just outside the red border you might see here. There's one area just north of where we are right now, known as Cumberland. Here's Cumberland. And as I zoom into Cumberland, you might start to see some things that kind of sound like what Rosemont's got. For one, you've got a performing arts center. That might be a place where you'd find theaters. You've got a mall over here. I'm guessing that there's probably a lot of hotels around here, especially because, oh boy, here's kind of like the Allstate Arena. There's a major entertainment venue. You've got a ballpark. What else is around here? You've got some corporate offices. That sounds like Rosemont. Some residences. So in that sense, it's a little bit different. You've also got, let's see, down here, some hotels. Where did the hotels go? I've lost the hotels. Let me go up towards more of this urban area and see if there's anything else that kind of resembles Rosemont. There's some of your hotels. Looks like it's a bit more residential up here. Major identifying feature of this area is an Air Force base, which obviously we don't really have around here. But you can see that Cumberland's probably got well-known shopping and entertainment. There's probably a bunch of restaurants here, and hotels for out-of-town visitors, especially people who are visiting families outside the Air Force base. That's it. Hopefully this made a bit more sense to you. Our next lesson will be on the foreign models. Email me if you have any questions, and take the reading quiz if you haven't done so yet. It'll be a lot easier now. Thank you.